There is a field in Somerset, in the southwest of England, that looks like nothing at all. Flat, green, crisscrossed by drainage ditches called rines, their dark water barely moving. Cattle graze there in the winter fog. Herons stand motionless at the edge of the water. The sky above the Somerset levels is enormous, unbroken by any hill or ridge, for miles in every direction, and the land beneath your feet feels slightly soft, slightly wrong, as if the earth has not fully decided whether it wants to be land or water. Most people who drive through this part of England do not stop. There is nothing, apparently, to stop for. But beneath that field, beneath the pale clay and the layers of peat that have accumulated over 2,000 years, there is a village. Not ruins in the way most people picture ruins, not fallen columns or crumbled walls, or the skeletal outlines of foundations left in bare stone. What lies beneath this Somerset field is something far stranger and far more remarkable than that. It is a village preserved, a village swallowed whole by rising water and cold anaerobic peat, and kept there, sealed, frozen in time, for more than 2 millennia. Wooden floors, hearths, the remains of looms, fragments of pottery decorated with spiraling designs of extraordinary beauty, animal bones still bearing the marks of the knives that cut them, seeds, textiles, the personal belongings of people who lived full, complex lives at a time when Julius Caesar had not yet crossed into Britain, when the city we now call Rome was still fighting for control of the Mediterranean world. A village older than Roman Britain, older than the roads that would eventually grid this landscape, older than the names we use for the places around it, and it was found by accident, almost missed entirely, almost lost forever beneath the draining ambitions of generations of Somerset farmers who wanted nothing more than dry ground to graze their animals on. This is the story of the Glastonbury Lake Village, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries ever made in the British Isles, a settlement built deliberately on the water on an artificial island constructed plank by plank and beam by people who understood their landscape so deeply that they chose to live in the middle of it, rather than on its edge. People who made art of haunting delicacy, who traded across hundreds of miles of pre-Roman Europe, who had a sophisticated understanding of metalwork and woodcraft and the movement of celestial bodies, and who left all of this behind when the water finally rose too high for them to stay. Before we go any further, if you are watching this for the first time, please click like and subscribe. This channel is dedicated to the hidden history of the British Isles, the stories that sit just beneath the surface of the landscape we think we know. And if that kind of history interests you, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Hit subscribe so you never miss one of these. Now, let us go back to Somerset. Let us go back to the water. The Somerset levels are one of the strangest landscapes in England. They sit at roughly sea level, bordered to the north by the Mendip Hills, and to the south and east by the Quantock and Polden Hills, and they are ancient wetland, ancient marsh, ancient fen. For most of human prehistory, this was not a place where people lived permanently. It was a place where people moved through, hunted, fished, and occasionally built extraordinary structures across the water and the bog. It was a liminal landscape in the truest sense of the word, neither fully land nor fully water, neither firmly in the human world nor entirely outside it. The wetlands of Somerset were formed over thousands of years by the interaction of rising sea levels after the last ice age, the accumulation of peat from decaying plant matter in waterlogged conditions, and the complex hydrology of rivers like the Brue, the Axe, and the Parrett, which drain this low-lying basin slowly and imperfectly into the Bristol Channel. At their most expansive, these wetlands covered an enormous area of the Somerset Plain, stretching across what are now agricultural fields with names like King's Sedgemoor and West Sedgemoor and Teelham Moor, names that retain the memory of the wetland in words even where the wetland itself has been engineered away. The process of draining the Somerset levels is itself a story of centuries. It began in earnest during the medieval period, when the monasteries of Glastonbury and Muchelney and Athelney began the slow work of digging channels and building embankments to claim land from the water. The monks of Glastonbury Abbey, sitting on their famous tor above the levels, looked down at all that flat wetland and saw not wilderness, but potential. They dug, they drained, they reclaimed. And the land that rose slowly from the water as they worked was extraordinarily fertile, dark with the compressed organic matter of thousands of years of waterlogged vegetation. By the post-medieval period, larger drainage schemes were underway. Dutch engineers were brought in, men with experience in reclaiming land from the sea in the Low Countries, and under their guidance, the network of rhines that now defines the Somerset landscape was extended and systematized. Water was pumped away, fields were levelled. The ancient wetland retreated, pushed back by the combined force of human ambition and engineering ingenuity. And as it retreated, it left behind things it had been keeping, preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor peat, objects and structures that would otherwise have rotted away completely over 2,000 years of exposure were revealed as the drainage works cut through the layers. Farmers pulling peat for fuel found wooden objects of clearly artificial construction. Labourers digging drainage channels encountered layers of clay and timber that seemed to have been deliberately placed. The landscape was giving things up slowly, reluctantly, one artifact at a time, to people who mostly did not know what they were looking at, and who, even when they did, often had no way to do anything useful with the knowledge. It was into this landscape, in the summer of 1892, that a young man named Arthur Bullied walked across a soggy Somerset field and noticed something that would change his life and alter our understanding of British prehistory forever. Arthur Bullied was 24 years old when he made his discovery. He was the son of a Glastonbury printer, educated locally, and possessed of an almost obsessive interest in archaeology that had been ignited in part by reading the works of Ferdinand Keller, a Swiss archaeologist who had spent years studying the prehistoric lake dwellings of the Swiss Alps. Settlements built on wooden platforms over the surfaces of alpine lakes, discovered in enormous numbers during the drainage works of the 1850s. Keller's work on the Swiss lake dwellings had caused a sensation in European archaeological circles. Here were entire prehistoric communities, preserved by the cold water of the alpine lakes, their material culture intact in ways that dryland archaeology simply could not replicate. Tools, textiles, food remains, structural timbers, evidence of trade and craft and domestic life stretching back thousands of years. The Swiss discoveries had transformed what scholars understood about prehistoric Europe, revealing a world of surprising sophistication and complexity. Bullied read all of this and began to wonder, if the Swiss Alps had lake dwellings, why not Somerset? The Somerset levels were analogous in certain ways to the Swiss Mittelland. They were ancient wetland. They had been occupied by prehistoric peoples. Surely, if one knew where to look, something similar might be found. So he looked. He walked the levels systematically, field by field, studying the ground, talking to local farmers, listening for any story of unusual finds or inexplicable structures encountered during drainage or peat cutting. He was methodical and patient in a way that young men with obsessions sometimes are, and he covered a great deal of soggy ground before. In a field just west of Glastonbury, near the village of Meare, he found what he was looking for. The field was called Nyland, and there was something wrong with it. To the trained eye, even one as young and inexperienced as Bullied's, the ground had a texture that was not right. There were shallow mounds, almost imperceptible, in a roughly circular arrangement. The surface had a slightly different colour from the surrounding land, and when Bullied pushed a stick into the earth, it met resistance at a depth of only a few inches. Not the resistance of stone or root, but the resistance of worked wood. Timber. He came back. He brought a probe. He systematically mapped the subsurface resistance across the field and found a coherent structure. Not random, not natural, deliberate. A platform of some kind, built from timber, surviving just below the modern surface of the field. Bullied was careful. He did not dig immediately. He secured permission from the landowner, a farmer who was probably bemused by the earnest young man with his probes and his notebooks. He corresponded with the leading archaeologists of the day, including General Augustus Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, the man who is often called the father of modern scientific archaeology. And then, in 1892, he began to dig. What came out of that Somerset field over the following years would astonish everyone who saw it. The village that Bullied uncovered was built on an artificial island. This is the first and most fundamental thing to understand about the Glastonbury Lake village. The people who created it did not find a natural island in the lake and settle on it. They built their island from scratch, in open water, using materials hauled to the site by boat or by hand across the shallows. The construction of the island was itself a remarkable feat of engineering. The builders began by driving wooden piles into the bed of the ancient lake. Then they laid down brushwood, bundles of cut branches and reeds, as a base layer. On top of the brushwood, they placed a layer of clay, dug from the surrounding dry land and transported to the site, which helped to bind and seal the brushwood platform. Then more brushwood, then more clay, then timber planking, then more clay. The island was built up layer by layer over what must have been years of sustained communal effort, and by the time it was complete, it covered an area of roughly 1.5 acres, a roughly circular platform sitting perhaps a foot or two above the surface of the surrounding water. Around the edge of the island ran a palisade, a fence of close-set wooden stakes driven into the lake bed and rising above the water level to form a defensive perimeter. This palisade was not a flimsy construction. The stakes were substantial, many of them trimmed and shaped with clear skill, and they would have presented a formidable barrier to anyone approaching the island from the water. The single entrance, or what appears to have been the primary access point, faced east toward the dry land of the ridge at Godney Moor. The causeway connecting the island to the mainland shore was another engineering achievement. It ran for several hundred yards across the shallow water and marsh, built on a foundation of brushwood and timber, in the same layered technique as the island platform itself. Walking across it would have been a specific experience, a deliberate transition from the dry world of the hilltops and fields into the water world of the lake village, and it seems likely that this transition carried meaning for the people who made it every day. On the island itself, the village was densely built. Bullied and his colleague Harold Gray, who joined the excavation and became Bullied's partner in the long work of documenting and interpreting what they found, identified at least 90 distinct structural mounds on the island surface. Each mound represented a building or a series of buildings built one on top of another as the island surface was periodically renewed and raised. The total number of structures that existed at the village during its lifetime of occupation may have been considerably higher. The houses were round. This is characteristic of Iron Age Britain broadly, but the Lake Village houses have been preserved in enough detail to allow reconstruction with unusual confidence. They were built on a base of clay laid over the wooden platform, with walls of wattle and daub, woven panels of split wood daubed with clay mixed with straw or animal hair. The roofs were almost certainly thatched with reed from the surrounding marshes, a material that would have been abundantly available and that the lake villagers clearly knew how to work with great skill, as the evidence of their other organic crafts suggests. The houses were typically between 30 and 40 feet in diameter. Each had a central hearth, a carefully constructed circle of clay or stone, where the fire was kept burning through the cold Somerset winters. The floors of the houses are among the most poignant survivals from the site. Laid with split timber planks or with clay, they bear the compressed evidence of daily life in extraordinary detail. The places where people sat repeatedly have slight depressions worn into them. The areas around the hearths show the scorching and smoke staining of thousands of meals cooked there over decades. And in the floors themselves, fallen through cracks and pressed into the clay beneath, are the small objects of ordinary existence. Seeds, grain, fish bones, fragments of pottery, the inevitable accumulation of things dropped, forgotten, lost, and preserved against all probability by 2,000 years of cold and wet. The artifacts recovered from the Glastonbury Lake Village fill glass cases in the Somerset County Museum in Taunton, where they have been displayed since the early 20th century. There are thousands of them, and they tell a story of a community that was simultaneously local and cosmopolitan, rooted in the specific ecology of the Somerset levels, and yet connected by trade and craft and cultural exchange to a much wider world. The pottery from the site is extraordinary. Iron Age ceramics from Britain are sometimes dismissed as utilitarian and unlovely, and it is true that much of the pottery of this period is indeed plain and functional. But the Glastonbury Lake Village produced pottery that is anything but plain. The pieces are decorated with sweeping, curvilinear designs, spirals and scrolls, and interlocking curves that belong unmistakably to the Latin artistic tradition, the great flowering of Celtic artistic expression that swept across Europe in the centuries before the Roman conquests. The designs on the Glastonbury pottery are not copied from continental originals. They are developed locally with their own regional flavour, their own particular way of organizing the geometric possibilities of a curved surface. They are the work of artists who understood a shared artistic language and spoke it with their own accent. The most famous single object from the site is a wooden vessel known as the Glastonbury bowl. It is a small, beautifully turned wooden cup, lathe-turned to a thinness that seems almost miraculous for an Iron Age craftsman working with hand tools. The outside surface is covered in latene decoration, a dense, interlocking design of curves that shifts and moves as you rotate the bowl in your hands. The pattern constantly suggesting new relationships between its elements, never quite resolving into simple repetition. It is among the finest pieces of Iron Age woodworking ever found in Britain, and it was found in a drainage ditch in Somerset, tucked into the peat as if someone had simply put it down and not come back for it. The metalwork from the site is equally impressive. Iron was worked at the village, as the evidence of iron slag and the remains of what appear to be smithing areas demonstrate. But the metal objects recovered are not merely functional. There are brooches of unusual delicacy, the safety pin-like fasteners that Iron Age Britons used to secure their clothing, some of them decorated with enamel in colours that still glow with startling brightness after 2,000 years in the peat. There are iron tools of sophisticated design, axes and knives and chisels whose form speaks to a deep understanding of metallurgy. There is bronze metalwork of considerable artistry, including pieces that show clear connections to continental European workshops, imported objects or objects made using imported techniques. The evidence of woodworking at the site is perhaps the most technically impressive of all. The lake villagers were master carpenters. The structural timbers of their houses and their island platform were worked with an accuracy and sophistication that implies specialized tools and specialized knowledge. The range of joints and techniques represented in the structural wood from the site is remarkable. Mortise and tenon joints, lap joints, pegged connections. The craftsmen who built this village understood wood deeply, understood how it moved and split and worked, how different species had different properties suited to different applications. Oak for the major structural beams, where strength and durability were needed. alder and willow for the lighter elements of walls and floors, species that grew abundantly in the wetland margins and that were easily worked when green, ash for tool handles and objects that needed to withstand impact. The choice of timber species at the site is not random. It reflects a nuanced and practical understanding of the material world. Among the most remarkable wooden objects from the site are fragments of what appear to be vehicles, wheel fragments, parts of hubs, sections of rim. The lake villagers had wheeled vehicles, carts or wagons of some kind, and the evidence of their wheels suggests a sophisticated tradition of wheel-making, with composite construction techniques that produce a strong and resilient wheel from multiple pieces of different woods, chosen for their specific mechanical properties. This is not simple technology. This is the product of a long tradition of craft knowledge, passed down through generations of craftsmen who refined their techniques over time. Textile production is evidenced by an abundance of loom weights, the clay or stone weights, that were hung from the bottom of an upright loom to keep the warp threads taut during weaving, and by spindle whorls, the small discs that were threaded onto a spindle stick to give it momentum during spinning. Wool was almost certainly the primary fibre spun and woven at the village, as sheep bones are well represented in the faunal assemblage from the site, but plant fibres may also have been worked. Flax could have been grown on the drier ground of the ridges above the levels, and the wetland itself provided materials for basketry and mat making. The evidence of basket work from the site includes impressions left in clay, where the woven texture of a basket has been pressed into the wet clay of a floor or a hearth surround and then preserved as the clay hardened. These impressions show a range of weaving techniques, from simple over-under patterns to complex twills, and they demonstrate a tradition of fibercraft that was clearly valued and highly developed. Food remains from the site paint a picture of a community that was well-fed and resourceful. Animal bones represent cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, dogs, and a range of wild species, including red deer, roe deer, beaver, otter, and various birds. Fish are represented by bones that can be identified to species, including eel, perch, pike, and roach, all species that would have been abundant in the shallow lake waters surrounding the village. Seeds and plant remains have been recovered from the anaerobic peat, preserved in remarkable condition. Grain, primarily emmer wheat and hulled barley, was clearly cultivated on the dry land surrounding the levels and stored at the village. But the plant assemblage also includes a wide range of wild species, gathered from the wetland and its margins. Raspberries, blackberries, slowberries, crabapples, hazelnuts. The diet of the lake villagers was varied and seasonally rich, supplemented by gathering from the extraordinary, natural larder of the wetland environment. To understand why people would choose to build their village on an artificial island in the middle of a lake, it is necessary to understand what the lake village meant in the context of Iron Age Britain, and what the Somerset levels represented in the landscape of that world. The Iron Age in Britain, the period roughly from 800 BCE to the Roman conquest of 43 CE, was not a time of primitive simplicity. It was a time of sophisticated social organization, long-distance trade, complex religious belief, and considerable technical achievement. The people who lived in Iron Age Britain were not isolated savages. They were part of a world that stretched from Ireland to the edges of the Eurasian steppe, connected by trade routes along which moved not just goods, but ideas, techniques, artistic styles, and people. The Latin artistic tradition that decorates the pottery and metalwork of the Glastonbury Lake village was not a local invention. It was the artistic expression of a shared cultural world, sometimes called Celtic, though that word is contested, that encompassed much of temperate Europe in the centuries around the birth of Christ. Within Britain itself, the Iron Age was a time of considerable population growth, and agricultural intensification. The landscape was being transformed by the expansion of farming into previously uncultivated areas, by the clearance of woodland, by the construction of field systems and trackways, and the elaborate hill forts that dominate the high ground of southern Britain. These hill forts, the great earthwork enclosures on the tops of hills, were the dominant form of settlement for the elites of Iron Age Britain, gathering places and defended strongholds that also functioned as centres of production and redistribution. Cadbury Castle, Maiden Castle, Ham Hill. The Mendip Hills above the Somerset levels were dotted with them. The lake village represents something different. It is not a hill fort. It is not a farmstead on good agricultural land. It is a settlement deliberately placed in a difficult, contested, marginal environment. And that choice tells us something important about the people who made it. Wetlands in prehistoric Britain carried profound symbolic significance. They were places between worlds, neither fully land nor fully water, neither entirely in the human domain nor entirely outside it. They were places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the supernatural world was thought to be thin, where communication with powers beyond the human was possible, where objects could be given to the water as offerings or as sacrifices. The extraordinary quantity of high-value metalwork that has been recovered from British wetlands over the centuries, swords, shields, cauldrons, jewellery of great artistry and value, represents not the losses of careless people, but the deliberate deposition of precious objects into liminal water, gifts given to whatever powers were thought to inhabit these in-between places. Living in the wetland, then, was not just a practical choice. It was a statement about who you were and where you stood in relation to the supernatural geography of the landscape. The lake villagers of Glastonbury lived at the threshold between worlds. Their island was a human space inserted into a space that was not quite human. The palisade that surrounded it marked a boundary, a line between the ordered world of the village and the wild water world beyond. And every day, every crossing of the causeway to the mainland and back was a passage across that threshold. Practically speaking, the wetland location also offered very real advantages. The lake provided abundant food. Fish could be netted or trapped year-round. Waterfowl could be caught in great numbers during the autumn and spring migrations. Eels, which were once extraordinarily abundant in the Somerset waterways, could be harvested in quantities that would have made a substantial contribution to the community's protein supply. The wetland margins produced reeds for thatch, willow and alder for construction and fuel, rushes for floor coverings and basketry. The water itself provided a degree of security that no dryland settlement could match. The lake was a moat. The island was a fortress. Any hostile approach would have been visible for a considerable distance across the open water, and the palisade and the single controlled access point would have made a determined assault costly and difficult. The community that built the Glastonbury Lake Village clearly had the resources and the organisational capacity to undertake a very large construction project. The amount of labour involved in building the island, transporting thousands of cubic yards of clay and timber across the water, driving hundreds of piles into the lake bed, building a causeway hundreds of yards long through open marsh, is staggering. This was not the work of a handful of families. It was a community project, requiring sustained collective effort over a long period of time. The social structures that could organize and sustain that effort must have been sophisticated, based on shared purpose, and probably on some form of recognized authority. Estimates of the village population at its peak vary. The number of houses that appear to have been simultaneously occupied, based on the evidence of the structural mounds, suggests somewhere between 100 and 200 individuals living on the island at any one time. This is a substantial community by the standards of the period, large enough to sustain internal specialization of labor, large enough to support craftsmen who spent much of their time making pottery or metalwork or wooden objects rather than growing or gathering food. The high quality of the artifacts from the site is in part a reflection of this specialization. The Glastonbury bowl was not made by someone who made bowls occasionally in their spare time. It was made by someone who made bowls regularly and who had developed, through practice and instruction, an extraordinarily high level of skill. The question of where the lake villagers came from and how the community was organized socially and politically is one that the archaeology can only answer in partial and suggestive ways. There are no written records from Iron Age Britain. The people who lived at the Glastonbury Lake village were illiterate, or at least they did not write in any medium that has survived. We know them only through their things. What their things suggest is a community that was part of a wider network of exchange and relationship that extended far beyond the Somerset levels. The presence of continental European artifacts and artistic influences at the site indicates contact with traders or travellers from across the Channel. Shale from Kimmeridge in Dorset, used to make bracelets and other ornaments, appears at the site, indicating connections to the trade networks that distributed this distinctive black shale across southern Britain. Salt, which does not preserve in the archaeological record directly, but whose production and distribution can be inferred from the distributions of distinctive pottery known as briquetage, used in the evaporation process, was clearly being obtained from somewhere, either from the coastal sultans of the Somerset coast or from more distant sources. The horses whose bones appear at the site were probably not kept purely for their meat. In Iron Age Britain, horses carried enormous prestige. They were associated with status, with mobility, with the warrior aristocracy, whose values shaped much of the cultural life of the period. Horse fittings, bits and terrets, and the decorative mounts that adorned harness are among the most elaborately decorated objects in Iron Age art, and examples of such fittings have been found at the lake village. Whether horses were stabled on the island or kept on the mainland nearby is not clear, but their presence in the archaeological record suggests that the community included people of some social standing, people for whom the ownership and display of horses was part of how they expressed their position in the world. The relationship between the Glastonbury Lake village and the other settlements in the surrounding landscape would have been complex and probably not static across the several centuries of the village's occupation. The hill forts on the Mendip and Polden Hills would have been the dominant centres of power in the region, and the lake village would have existed in some relationship of exchange and probably subordination to those centres. Whether the lake village paid tribute to a hill fort lord, whether it served as a specialist production centre that supplied craft goods in exchange for agricultural produce from the surrounding dry land, whether it had a particular ritual or commercial function within the regional economy, all of these questions remain open. But what seems clear is that the lake village was not isolated. It was part of a landscape of settlements that were connected to each other by roads and tracks and waterways, and by the social relationships that those physical connections sustained. The nearest major hill fort to the lake village was Cannington, on a ridge above the Quantocks, and there were smaller defended enclosures on the Polden Hills that would have been visible from the levels below. The Glastonbury Tor, that extraordinary isolated hill that rises so dramatically from the flat levels, was also presumably a significant landmark in the Iron Age landscape, though the evidence for Iron Age occupation of the Tor itself is limited. What these various high points and defended enclosures represented in the social geography of Iron Age Somerset is a question that archaeologists continue to debate, but they clearly constituted a structured landscape within which the lake village occupied a specific and meaningful position. Arthur Bullied and Harold Gray excavated the Glastonbury Lake village over a period of 26 years, from 1892 to 1907 for the main excavation, with additional seasons in later years. Their work was conducted in conditions that we might now find extraordinary. They were digging in the open field in all weathers, dealing with the constant problem of groundwater flooding the trenches almost as fast as they could be dug. They were working with the technology of Victorian archaeology, which by the standards of its time was quite rigorous and scientific. Bullied and Gray were meticulous recorders and careful observers, but which by modern standards was inevitably limited in what it could extract from the material. Nevertheless, the publication that emerged from their work, a two-volume monograph on the Glastonbury Lake Village, published in 1911 and 1917, remains a fundamental reference for anyone studying the site. It is comprehensive, detailed, and written with a scholarly care that reflects both men's deep commitment to getting the record right. Bullied spent much of the rest of his long life working on and around the Somerset levels, and the lake village remained at the centre of his archaeological world until his death in 1941. The excavation methods of the era, however, meant that much information was inevitably lost. The three-dimensional spatial relationships between objects, the precise stratigraphic contexts that tell modern archaeologists so much about the sequence of events at a site, the full range of environmental evidence that techniques like palynology and flotation can now extract from archaeological deposits. None of this could be recovered in 1892. What Bullied and Gray could do was identify structures, collect objects, and make detailed plans and drawings of what they found. They did this very well, but the limitations of what they could know from the methods available to them were real. Modern analysis of the collections from Glastonbury, using techniques that were simply not available to Bullied and Gray, has added enormously to our understanding of the site. Radiocarbon dating has given us a much more precise picture of when the village was occupied. The dates cluster in the period from roughly 300 BCE to 50 CE, with the main phase of occupation in the 2 centuries or so before the Roman conquest of Britain in 43 CE. This makes the lake village a settlement of the Middle to Late Iron Age, contemporary with the great expansion of Roman power across the Mediterranean world, and with the period of Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul that brought Roman armies to the shores of Britain for the first time. When Caesar made his 2 expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, the people of the Glastonbury Lake village were living in their island settlement, weaving and potting and smithing, fishing the shallow waters of their lake, walking the causeway to the mainland to tend their animals and cultivate their fields, trading with communities across southern Britain and with contacts on the European continent. They were not aware of Rome in any direct sense. Rome was a distant rumour, a name attached to the armies that were doing terrible things to the Gaulish peoples across the water. But the effects of Rome's expansion were already rippling through the trade networks that connected Britain to the continent, changing the flows of goods and the dynamics of power in ways that would eventually transform the island fundamentally. The lake village was not a victim of the Roman conquest directly. It appears to have been abandoned sometime around the middle of the 1st century CE, which is roughly when the Roman conquest began. But the connection between the two events is probably not simple or causal. The abandonment of the lake village was more likely the result of environmental change, a gradual rise in the water levels of the Somerset levels that made continued occupation of the island increasingly difficult, combined perhaps with broader social and political changes in the region as the Roman presence began to assert itself. The environmental history of the Somerset levels is itself a story of constant change and negotiation between water and land. The levels are not a stable landscape. They have fluctuated between wet and dry states multiple times over the past 10,000 years, driven by changes in sea level, by variations in rainfall and temperature, and by the cumulative effects of human activity on the surrounding watershed. During the Mesolithic period, 10,000 years ago, the levels were a dense woodland of alder and birch, gradually being drowned by rising sea levels as the glacial meltwater raised the global ocean. By the Neolithic, 5 and 6,000 years ago, much of the levels was open water or reed swamp, with islands of higher ground rising from the wetland. It was across this Neolithic landscape that some of the most remarkable wooden structures in all of British prehistory were built. The Sweet Track, discovered in 1970 during peat-cutting operations on the levels at a site near Shapwick, is one of the oldest wooden structures in the world. It is a raised walkway built across the surface of the Neolithic marsh that was dated by tree ring analysis with extraordinary precision to the winter of 3807 to 3806 BCE. Nearly 6,000 years ago, Neolithic people built a plank walkway across the Somerset wetland using a sophisticated construction technique involving a lower rail of crossed poles onto which the walking surface of split oak planks was pegged. The walkway ran for nearly 2 kilometres, connecting two areas of dry ground across the open marsh. Along the length of the Sweet Track, and buried in the peat beside it, archaeologists found offerings: pottery, flint tools, a polished jadeite axe of extraordinary beauty, made from a stone that does not occur in Britain and that can be traced to source quarries high in the Italian Alps, transported thousands of miles by a series of exchanges to reach this Somerset marsh. The jadeite axe was buried deliberately beside the track, placed in the peat, not as a lost object, but as a gift, given to the water and the mud in the way that people throughout prehistory gave precious things to liminal places. The Sweet Track was not the only prehistoric wooden trackway on the Somerset levels. Dozens of similar structures have been found, dating from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. Some are simple bundles of brushwood laid across the wet ground. Others are elaborate engineered structures of split timber. Collectively, they represent thousands of years of human movement across the levels, generations of communities crossing and recrossing the wetland on routes that must have been maintained and renewed repeatedly as the wood worst rotted and the water levels changed. Flag Fen, in the Cambridgeshire Fens far to the northeast, is another wetland site that reveals the same fundamental pattern. At Flag Fen, Bronze Age people built a massive artificial island and a timber causeway, stretching for nearly a kilometre across the fenland water, depositing thousands of objects in the water beside the causeway over a period of several centuries. The objects include bronze swords, daggers, spearheads, and personal ornaments, deliberately bent or broken before deposition, given to the water in a practice that speaks to the same understanding of wetland as a place between worlds that we see in the Somerset evidence. The pattern repeats across Britain. Lynn Terrigbach in Anglesey, where a remarkable collection of Iron Age metalwork was thrown into a lake over several centuries, including objects that came from across Britain and from Ireland, demonstrating that this Welsh wetland was a place of significance, not just locally, but regionally. The Broiter Hoard from County Londonderry in Northern Ireland, a collection of gold objects deposited in what was then tidal water. The Wilsford Shaft in Wiltshire, a deep shaft that may have been dug to reach groundwater and into which offerings were dropped. The pattern is consistent. British prehistoric people, from the Neolithic to the Iron Age and beyond, understood water as a medium through which the boundaries between the ordinary world and the world of supernatural power could be crossed. The Glastonbury Lake Village existed within this tradition, embedded in it. The choice to build on the water was not simply pragmatic. It was also an expression of a way of understanding the world, a world in which the watery margins of the landscape were charged with meaning and power, and in which choosing to live there was a statement about identity and relationship to that power. The Somerset levels also preserved, in the extraordinary conditions of anaerobic peat, evidence of an even older story than the lake village. The evidence of human occupation of the levels stretches back to the Mesolithic, the period after the last ice age and before the development of farming, when the landscape was forest and the people who moved through it were hunters and gatherers who left behind their flint tools and their hearths in the layers of ancient sediment. At a site called Gold Cliff on the foreshore of the Severn Estuary, just across the water from the Somerset levels in what is now Wales, the retreating tide regularly reveals the surfaces of ancient intertidal sediments that contain footprints. Human footprints preserved in the mud that hardened and was then buried under subsequent deposits, dating to the Mesolithic period more than 7,000 years ago. The footprints are of adults and children, moving across the mud of what was then an estuary edge, and they are among the most moving survivals from prehistoric Britain. The size of the feet, the depth of the impression, the direction of travel, all of these things bring you into startlingly close contact with people who lived in this landscape at the very beginning of the post-glacial period, before the English Channel had fully opened, when you could have walked from what is now Britain to what is now France on dry land. The landscape of the Somerset levels has been continuously occupied, in one way or another, for at least 10,000 years, and the lake village, remarkable as it is just one episode in that long story. A particularly vivid episode, particularly well preserved, but one thread in a very long cloth. This is part of what makes the discovery of the lake village so significant in the broader context of British prehistoric archaeology. It demonstrates that the apparent simplicity of the pre-Roman British world, a simplicity long assumed by historians working in the classical tradition, is an illusion created by the absence of written records rather than a reflection of reality. The lake villages were not simple. They were not primitive. They were members of a sophisticated, complex, technologically and artistically accomplished civilization that had developed over thousands of years in the British Isles, drawing on influences from a wider European world, but developing its own distinctive character. The relationship between the Glastonbury Lake Village and the other lake village, discovered on the Somerset levels at Meare, just a few miles to the northwest, is one of the most interesting puzzles in British Iron Age archaeology. The Meare Lake Village, or more accurately, the two villages at Meare, known as Meare West and Meare East, was discovered by Bullied after his work at Glastonbury and excavated in subsequent decades. The Meare villages were similar in construction to the Glastonbury village, artificial islands built on the same layered timber and clay technique, but they appear to have been used differently. The evidence from Meare suggests a seasonal rather than permanent occupation. The density of artifacts is extraordinary, among the highest of any Iron Age site in Britain, but the structural evidence for permanent year-round habitation is less convincing than at Glastonbury. Some archaeologists have argued that the Meare villages functioned as periodic gathering places rather than permanent settlements, perhaps used for seasonal fairs or markets where communities from across the levels and the surrounding hills came together to exchange goods, conduct social business, and perform religious ceremonies. If this interpretation is correct, then the Somerset levels in the Iron Age contained both a permanently occupied settlement, the Glastonbury Lake Village, and a periodic gathering place just a few miles away, a two-node system that served both the daily needs of a resident community and the periodic needs of a wider regional population. The combination of the two sites would have made the levels a significant centre of activity in the Iron Age landscape of southwestern Britain, drawing people and goods and ideas from a large surrounding area. The artifacts from Meare are, if anything, even more spectacular than those from Glastonbury. The sheer quantity of metalwork from the site is astonishing. Hundreds of brooches, dozens of iron tools and weapons, bronze objects of great artistry, and among it all, a series of objects that have no clear parallel elsewhere in Britain, that seem to represent either local manufacturing traditions, unique to the Meare area, or the products of a particular workshop tradition that we have not yet been able to trace to a source. The relationship between the two lake village communities, if they were indeed separate communities rather than a single community that used both sites, is not fully understood. They were close enough to have been in regular contact. They were occupied during overlapping periods. They shared artistic traditions and presumably many aspects of material culture. But whether they were part of a single social unit or represented distinct groups in a relationship of exchange and interaction is not a question the archaeology can yet definitively answer. What both sites together demonstrate is the importance of the Somerset levels as a zone of distinctive cultural practice in Iron Age Britain. The wetland was not a marginal backwater. It was a central place, a place where people chose to invest enormous amounts of labour and ingenuity, a place that generated some of the most remarkable art objects in the British Iron Age, a place that was, for the communities that lived in and around it, clearly of great significance. The construction sequence of the Glastonbury Lake Village tells a story of repeated renewal and rebuilding over the centuries of its occupation. The island was not built once and then occupied unchanged for 300 years. It was constantly being rebuilt, reinforced, raised, extended. As the island surface sank under the weight of the structures on it, and under the constant soaking of the surrounding water, new layers of clay and timber were laid down to raise the level again. As houses fell into disrepair, they were demolished and new ones built, sometimes directly on top of the ruins of the old ones, so that the structural mounds that Bullied identified in 1892 represent not single buildings, but compressed sequences of buildings, one on top of another, accumulated over generations. This process of renewal means that the island was in a very real sense a living structure, continuously maintained by the community that depended on it. The effort required to keep the island habitable was itself a form of communal activity that would have bound the community together. Bringing clay from the mainland, cutting and transporting timber, driving piles, laying brushwood. These were tasks that required coordination and collective effort, and they were tasks that had to be done repeatedly, not just once at the founding of the village, but continuously throughout its life. There are moments in the archaeological record where major events seem to have occurred. One phase of rebuilding, identifiable in the stratigraphy of the island, was apparently triggered by a fire. The evidence of burning is widespread in one level of the site, and the rebuilding that follows it is substantial, suggesting that a significant portion of the village was destroyed and had to be reconstructed. Fire was an ever-present risk in a settlement of thatched wooden buildings, and a fire in a densely built village on an island surrounded by water would have been both destructive and extremely difficult to fight. The psychological impact of such an event on the community, the loss of homes and possessions, and possibly of people, would have been profound. Another period of intensive construction activity is visible in the record, associated with what appears to be an expansion of the island perimeter. The palisade was apparently rebuilt and extended on at least one occasion, suggesting that the community was investing in its defensive infrastructure at a particular moment of concern or threat. What that threat was cannot now be determined. The Iron Age was not a peaceful time, and the communities of southwestern Britain were not immune to the raiding and warfare that characterized the period in the historical sources from the continent. But whether the Lake Village community at Glastonbury faced specific military threats from neighbouring groups is not something the archaeology tells us directly. The final phase of the village's occupation is marked by a gradual deterioration of the island structure. The evidence suggests that maintenance of the platform became increasingly difficult to sustain, and that the island was subsiding into the water more rapidly than the community could counteract. This may have been a consequence of rising water levels in the levels generally, a reflection of the wetter climatic conditions that characterize the late Iron Age in the Somerset region, or it may have been a consequence of the depletion of readily available construction materials in the immediate area, or both. The end of the lake village was probably not sudden or dramatic. It was more likely a gradual process of abandonment, as conditions made life on the island increasingly uncomfortable, and as the practical calculus of maintaining the structure shifted in the direction of leaving rather than staying. By the middle of the 1st century CE, the island was abandoned. The buildings that had been left standing decayed and fell. The palisade posts rotted at the waterline and toppled. The causeway, unwalked and unmaintained, sank back into the marsh, and the water rose over everything, covering the remains of 3 centuries of human life in the cold, dark, preserving peat. And there the village stayed, unseen and unsuspected, for 2,000 years. To appreciate fully what the discovery of the Glastonbury Lake Village meant for our understanding of pre-Roman Britain, it is necessary to understand what people believed about that period before the discovery was made, and before the broader revolution in prehistoric archaeology that the 20th century brought. For most of the period from the Renaissance onward, educated Europeans understood the history of Britain before the Roman conquest in terms derived almost entirely from the classical sources. Julius Caesar's account of his British campaigns, written in the 50s BCE, provided the most detailed description of the island's inhabitants, and what he described was a society of warriors organized in tribal groupings, largely rural, practicing agriculture, but without the urban traditions or the written culture that, to a Roman perspective, marked a fully civilized people. Later Roman writers, Tacitus, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, added details, some based on genuine observation and some on travelers' tales or pure invention, that collectively painted a picture of barbarian Britain, fierce, warlike, strange in its customs, primitive in its material culture. The Druids, the religious specialists of Iron Age Gaulish and British society, were a particular focus of Roman attention. They were described as practicing human sacrifice, presiding over sacred groves, possessing some esoteric knowledge that they transmitted orally through a process of lengthy memorization rather than in writing. The Roman accounts of the Druids oscillated between fascinated horror and a kind of reluctant admiration for their philosophical sophistication. But the overall picture was of a society that was, by the standards the Romans applied to themselves, underdeveloped, superstitious, and in need of the civilization that Roman conquest would bring. This was the picture that persisted in popular and even scholarly consciousness for a very long time. The pre-Roman Britons were the naked, blue-painted savages of the popular imagination, fierce but unsophisticated, possessing a warlike courage that the Romans found admirable, but lacking the cultural achievements that would earn them a place in the narrative of civilized human development. The discoveries at Glastonbury and at Meare, and at a growing number of other Iron Age sites across Britain, demolished this picture systematically over the course of the 20th century. What the archaeology revealed was a society of considerable complexity and accomplishment. The metalwork of Iron Age Britain, particularly the work of the Latin artistic tradition, is now recognized as one of the great artistic achievements of world prehistory. The engineering sophistication demonstrated at the Glastonbury Lake Village, the constructional knowledge embodied in the timber structures of Flag Fen, the organizational capacity required to build the great hill forts, all of this spoke to a society that was sophisticated in ways that the Roman sources, written by conquerors with an interest in justifying their conquest, could not afford to acknowledge. Iron Age Britain was not a civilization in the Roman sense. It did not have cities. It did not have writing in any form that has survived. It did not have the administrative structures that allowed Rome to govern a vast empire. But it was a complex, culturally rich, economically integrated society with deep roots in the landscape and a distinctive way of understanding and inhabiting the world. The Lake Village is one of the most vivid demonstrations of this complexity, a physical embodiment of what Iron Age Britain was capable of when it brought its full technical and organizational resources to bear on a chosen project. The question of language at the Glastonbury Lake Village is one that archaeology cannot directly answer, but that linguistics can approach from another direction. The language spoken by the lake villagers was almost certainly a form of Celtic, the language family that was spoken across most of temperate Europe in the Iron Age, and that survives today in the modern Celtic languages of Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, and Cornwall. The Celtic languages are divided into two main groups: the Goidelic languages, which include Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx, and the Brittonic languages, which include Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. The prehistoric language of Britain was Brittonic, an ancestor of modern Welsh, and it was this language, or something very close to it, that the people of the Glastonbury Lake village would have spoken. The survival of Celtic languages in the modern world is itself a story of extraordinary resilience. The Roman conquest imposed Latin on the elite of British society and on the urban centres that grew up under Roman rule, but it did not eliminate Brittonic from the countryside. When Roman Britain collapsed in the early 5th century CA and the legions withdrew, the Celtic languages reasserted themselves in much of the island. Then came the Anglo-Saxon migrations from the continent, and Brittonic was pushed progressively westward, surviving into the modern period only in the far west. Wales, Cornwall, and among the emigrants who crossed to Brittany. Welsh, the most robustly surviving of the Brittonic languages, preserves in its structure and vocabulary traces of the language that was spoken in the Somerset levels 2,000 years ago. When you hear Welsh spoken, you are in a very real sense hearing a distant echo of the language of the lake village, a language that evolved continuously from the tongue in which the lake villagers argued and joked and told their children stories and called out to each other across the water on a Somerset morning. This linguistic continuity is not simply a curiosity, it is a reminder that the people of the Glastonbury Lake village were not aliens, not an incomprehensible other from a world unconnected to our own. They were ancestors, in the broadest cultural and genetic sense, of the people who live in Britain today. The thread of human continuity that connects the lake village to the present is unbroken. There were no extinctions, no total replacements. The coming of the Romans, then the Saxons, then the Normans, each brought change and disruption. But through all of it, the underlying population of Britain retained significant continuity with its prehistoric past. The genes of the lake villagers circulate in the blood of living Britons. Their language, transformed but not destroyed, is still spoken in the mountains of Wales. The wider landscape of the Somerset levels in the Iron Age was not simply a zone of wetland occupation. The levels were surrounded by a ring of higher ground, the Mendip Hills to the north, the Polden Hills to the south, the Quantocks to the southwest, and the Isle of Avalon, the great lump of higher ground on which Glastonbury Tor stands, rising from the levels to the east of the lake village site. This higher ground was extensively occupied throughout the Iron Age, and the relationship between the communities of the high ground and the lake village community below would have been complex and multifaceted. The hill forts of the Mendip Hills, Maysbury Castle, Charterhouse, Dolbury Warren were major centres of population and power in the Iron Age landscape, controlling the high ground and the lead deposits of the Mendips, which were a significant economic resource both before and after the Roman conquest. Lead from the Mendips circulated widely in the pre-Roman trade networks of southern Britain, and the communities that controlled access to it were clearly wealthy and powerful. The Lake Village community almost certainly had connections to the Mendip lead trade, either through exchange relationships with the hill fort communities or through direct access to the distribution networks. The Polden Hills, to the south of the levels, were the source of a remarkable hoard of Iron Age metalwork, discovered in 1800 at Shapwick, whose significance was not fully appreciated at the time of discovery, and many of whose objects were subsequently lost or melted down. The Polden Hills hoard, as it is known from the surviving pieces, included horse fittings, brooches, and other objects of high quality, and was buried in the soil of the Poldens at a date roughly contemporary with the later period of the Lake Village's occupation. Whether the people who buried the Polden Hills hoard had any direct connection to the Lake Village community is not known, but both groups were part of the same Iron Age world of the Somerset region. The Glastonbury Tor, that extraordinary conical hill that rises 158 metres above the levels, and that is visible for miles in every direction, occupies a peculiar position in the mythology of both the Iron Age and the later medieval period. The Arthurian legends, those great stories of British identity and loss that crystallized in the medieval period but drew on much older traditions, identified Glastonbury as the Isle of Avalon, the sacred island to which the mortally wounded King Arthur was carried to be healed or to await return. The etymology of Glastonbury in the Old Brittonic language has been plausibly linked to roots meaning glass or glastum, a blue plant dye, and the name itself may preserve a memory of the watery, island-like character of the Glastonbury area in prehistory, when the levels around it were still flooded and the Tor rose from the water like an island. Whether Arthur was a historical figure, and if so, what historical reality lies beneath the accumulated legends, is a question that historians and archaeologists continue to debate without reaching any consensus. But the association of Glastonbury with sacred water and with ideas of the isle between worlds is clearly very old, and it connects to the same understanding of the wetland landscape as a liminal and spiritually charged space that we see in the lake village itself. The people who built their island on the lake below the Tor were drawing on traditions of wetland sacredness that were ancient even in their time, and that were ancient in a different sense, even in the medieval period when the Arthurian stories were being written down. The modern archaeological understanding of the Glastonbury Lake Village has been transformed by a series of research projects conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, using techniques and analytical methods that were simply not available to Bullied and Gray. Environmental archaeology, the systematic study of plant remains, animal bones, insect faunas, pollen sequences, and other biological materials from archaeological sites, has revolutionized our understanding of what the lake village environment was like and how it changed over the period of occupation. Pollen samples from the peat layers around the site have allowed reconstruction of the vegetation of the surrounding landscape at successive periods, showing the balance between woodland, heath, and grassland on the dry ground above the levels, and the succession of wetland plant communities in the levels themselves. This evidence tells a story of landscape change, driven partly by natural processes and partly by human activity, the clearance of woodland for agriculture, the management of wetland for resources, the modification of drainage patterns, analysis of the insect fauna preserved in the anaerobic sediments of the site, a technique known as fossil insect analysis or coleopteran analysis, after the order of beetles that are particularly well represented, has provided evidence for the conditions in and around the village that is almost shockingly specific. Beetles that are associated with stored grain indicate the presence of granaries or storage vessels of grain, confirming the indirect evidence from grain seeds in the archaeological record. Beetles associated with damp, decaying wood indicate the condition of the structural timbers at various periods. Beetles associated with animals, parasites of cattle and sheep, and the insects that breed in dung, give a picture of animal keeping practices that can be mapped onto the space of the island. Taken together, this evidence builds a sensory picture of the lake village that is extraordinarily vivid. The smell of a working agricultural community, the sounds and the dirt and the biological vitality of a densely inhabited space. Isotope analysis of animal and human bones from the site and from related sites in the region has begun to shed light on questions of diet, movement, and origin that were previously unanswerable. The isotopic signature of oxygen preserved in tooth enamel, formed during childhood, reflects the isotopic signature of the water drunk during tooth formation, which in turn reflects the geological character of the landscape in which childhood was spent. By comparing the isotopic signatures of individuals buried in Iron Age cemeteries in the Somerset region with the baseline signatures of the Somerset geology, it is possible to identify individuals who grew up locally and individuals who came from elsewhere. The evidence, still limited but growing, suggests that Iron Age Somerset was not an entirely closed population. There was movement of individuals, and presumably the social connections and cultural exchanges that went with such movement. Dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating, has provided some of the most precise dates available from the site. Timbers from the lake village that preserve enough growth rings can be matched to the master chronologies built up from thousands of tree ring sequences across Britain and Europe. And where a match is possible, the date of felling can be determined to the exact year and sometimes to the season within that year. The precision of dendrochronological dating is startling by the standards of most archaeological chronology. Not sometime in the 3rd century BCE, but in the spring of 268 BCE, when a particular oak was felled and its timber used in a particular phase of construction at the lake village. This kind of precision transforms our sense of the site from a general phenomenon of a particular period to a sequence of specific events in specific years. The results of these modern analyses have confirmed and extended the picture that Bullied and Gray established from their excavations. The lake village was occupied from roughly 300 BCE to 50 CE, with the main period of intensive occupation in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. It was a real community, a permanent settlement rather than a seasonal camp, with a population of perhaps 1 to 200 people living year-round on the island. It was connected to a wider world by trade and perhaps by kinship and alliance. It was abandoned gradually as water levels rose and maintenance became increasingly difficult. Somewhere around the middle of the 1st century in CE, the story of what happened to the lake village area after its abandonment is itself instructive. The Roman conquest of Britain proceeded rapidly through the southwest of England, with the 2nd Legion Augusta under the future Emperor Vespasian, conducting a series of campaigns that reduced the hill forts of the region one by one, including the great hill fort of Maiden Castle in Dorset, where the scars of Roman assault are still visible in the landscape. By 50 CE, the year around which the lake village was being abandoned, the Roman military presence was firmly established in the southwest, and the process of civilian settlement and urban development that would transform the region over the following centuries was beginning. The town of Lindinis, later known as Ilchester, was established as a Roman settlement in the Yeo Valley, not far from the Polden Hills and at the southern edge of the Somerset levels. Bath, Aquae Sulis, the sacred hot springs of the goddess Sulis, became one of the most celebrated religious and bathing complexes in Roman Britain. The Roman road network, those extraordinary straight lines that still determine the routes of many modern roads, was extended through the region, knitting the newly conquered territory into the administrative and economic infrastructure of the empire. And the levels themselves, those ancient wetlands that had sheltered and fed and inspired so many generations of prehistoric communities, were explored for their agricultural potential. Roman villas appeared on the better drained ground at the edges of the levels, their owners presumably farming the surrounding land with the intensive agricultural methods that Roman colonization brought. The levels themselves may have been used for summer grazing of animals moved from the drier uplands, a practice of transhumance that continued in the area well into the medieval period. The lake village site, now underwater and accumulating peat, was presumably unknown to the Romans who farmed and travelled through the area. There is no evidence of Roman engagement with the site, no Roman objects in the deposits from the lake village period, no Roman structure built over the island site. The Romans who settled in Somerset did not know that beneath the boggy field near Glastonbury lay the preserved remains of a community that had lived there for 3 centuries before their arrival, that had built and maintained a remarkable artificial island and had created objects of extraordinary artistry, that had been a centre of craft production and regional exchange in a landscape that the Romans would reshape beyond recognition. The irony is that the very Roman drainage works and the later medieval and post-medieval draining of the levels that eventually exposed the lake village by lowering the water table and revealing the peat in which it was preserved were also the processes that had kept the village hidden for so long. Without the water and the peat, there would have been nothing to preserve. The lake village owes its survival to the same wetland character that the drainage engineers were working to eliminate. The site today is protected. The scheduled monument protection that covers the Glastonbury Lake Village site means that no further large-scale excavation is permitted without specific authorization. The remaining deposits, those areas of the site that Bullied and Gray did not excavate, are preserved in the ground for future archaeologists, using techniques that do not yet exist, but that will undoubtedly reveal things that current methods cannot. This principle of preservation for the future, of leaving some of the site unexcavated so that future generations with better methods can learn from it, is now a standard principle of archaeological practice in Britain and in most of the world, though it was not universally followed in Bullied's time. It reflects a kind of archaeological humility, an acknowledgement that our current methods, however good they are not the last word, that the things we cannot yet know will become knowable in the future, and that the best service we can do for those future investigators is to leave them something to investigate. The artifacts from the Glastonbury Lake Village are preserved in the Somerset County Museum in Taunton and in the Glastonbury Lake Village Museum in Glastonbury itself, a small but wonderful museum dedicated specifically to the site, where visitors can see the objects recovered from the excavation and learn about the community that made them. The Glastonbury Bowl, that masterpiece of Iron Age woodworking, is in Taunton, where it sits in its case and invites the viewer to consider the hands that made it and the person who used it. The brooches gleam under the museum lights with their enamel still vivid. The iron tools retain the shape given them by smiths who worked by firelight in the reed-thatched smithy on the island platform. But the most important preservation of the lake village is in the landscape itself. The field near Glastonbury, where Bullied first pushed his probe into the ground and felt the resistance of ancient timber, is still a field. The levels around it are still managed wetland, the rhines still carrying their slow, dark water, the herons still standing at their margins. The layers of peat beneath the surface still hold what they have held for 2,000 years. The village is still there, still waiting, still giving up its secrets in small increments to the investigators who come to it with new questions and new tools. The discovery of the Glastonbury Lake Village belongs to a tradition of wetland archaeology that has transformed our understanding of prehistoric Europe over the past century and a half. From the Swiss lake dwellings that inspired Bullied's search to the Danish bog bodies that stare at us across 2 millennia with their features preserved in uncanny detail, to the great peat bogs of Ireland that have yielded wooden trackways and buried butter and gold horns, and the preserved remains of people killed in circumstances we can reconstruct in extraordinary physical detail. Wetland archaeology has consistently produced revelations that overturn our assumptions about what the past was like. The preservation conditions of wetland sites, the cold, oxygen-poor, acidic conditions of waterlogged peat and lake sediment, preserve organic materials that are destroyed everywhere else. Wood, textiles, leather, plant remains, human tissue. These are the categories of material that constitute the overwhelming bulk of what any human community produces and uses, and they are precisely the categories that are invisible in normal archaeological conditions, where only stone and fired clay and metal survive. Wetland archaeology recovers the invisible majority of the material past, and in doing so, it gives us access to a version of human prehistory that is incomparably richer and more human than the impoverished record of stone and pot that dryland archaeology can provide. The people of the Glastonbury Lake village wore clothes. They slept in beds or on woven mats. They carried their possessions in baskets and bags. They ate from wooden bowls. They stored their grain in containers of wood and wicker. They crossed their island on wooden walkways. They repaired their boats with wooden pegs. Nearly all of these things have left no trace in the archaeological record of the vast majority of Iron Age sites in Britain. At Glastonbury, the water and the peat preserved them, and in that preservation, something that is usually lost is recovered. Not just the objects themselves, but the texture of daily life, the specific, sensory, human reality of existence in a particular place and time. One of the questions that has fascinated archaeologists working on the Somerset Lake villages is the question of belief. What did the people of the Glastonbury Lake village believe? What was their cosmology, their understanding of the world and their place in it? What powers did they propitiate? What ceremonies did they perform? What ideas about life and death and the nature of reality structured their existence? This is precisely the question that archaeology is least well equipped to answer. Belief leaves the faintest traces in the material record. Where it is visible at all, it is visible indirectly, in the pattern of what is kept and what is discarded, in the things that are given to water or buried in earth, in the orientation of the dead and the objects placed with them, in the shape of spaces that seem designed for communal gathering rather than practical purpose. At the lake village, there are hints. The practice of depositing objects in the water of the surrounding lake is one. Finds from the sediments immediately outside the palisade include metal objects of clear value, objects that seem to have been placed rather than dropped, given to the water in a deliberate act. The careful treatment of the hearths in the houses, the way they are consistently built and rebuilt in specific central positions, the way the floor area around them is clean and carefully maintained, suggests that the hearth was more than just a practical device for warmth and cooking. It was a focal point of domestic life and probably of domestic ritual, the fire that was never allowed to go out, the center around which the family gathered, and where the offerings that maintained the household's connection to its protective powers were made. The heads of animals, particularly of cattle, appear to have been treated differently from the rest of the carcass at the lake village, deposited in particular locations rather than simply discarded with the other food debris. The skull cult, the reverence accorded to the head as the seat of power and identity, is well attested in Iron Age Europe, both in the archaeological record and in the classical sources, which describe the Gaulish practice of taking and preserving the heads of enemies. Whether similar practices existed at the lake village cannot be proven, but the differential treatment of skulls in the faunal assemblage is at least consistent with such a tradition. The circular form of the lake village houses is itself worth reflecting on. Round houses are the dominant architectural form in Iron Age Britain, and their prevalence is so consistent across so many different regions and periods that it clearly reflects something more than simple practicality. A rectangular house is in many ways easier to build and to furnish than a round one. The persistence of the round form in the face of this practical disadvantage suggests that it carried meaning, that the shape of the house was understood to have significance beyond its function as a shelter. In many world cultures, circular structures are associated with ideas of completeness, of the cycle of the year, of the cosmos ordered around a central axis. The central hearth of the round house is a natural axis mundi, a symbolic center around which the household cosmos is organized. Whether the Iron Age Britons who built round houses thought in precisely these terms is not something we can know, but the formal consistency of the architectural choice demands some explanation beyond the purely functional. The landscape of the levels themselves would have been a landscape of omens and powers. The movement of water through the drainage channels, the behavior of fish and waterfowl, the mists that rolled across the flat ground in the early mornings and the late evenings, the fires visible on distant hilltops, the progress of sun and moon and stars across the enormous Somerset sky, all of these would have been read as meaningful, as communications from powers that inhabited the landscape, and that could be understood and responded to by those with the knowledge to interpret them. The Druids, those much mythologized figures of Iron Age religious life, were at their most basic a priestly class whose function was precisely this kind of interpretation and mediation, maintaining the community's relationships with the powers that governed the natural world. We cannot know what specific rituals were performed at the lake village. We cannot know the names of the powers invoked or the form that invocations took. But we can know that for the people who lived there, the world was not disenchanted, not a mechanical system operating by impersonal laws. It was alive with meaning and power, and their lives were lived in constant relationship to that meaning and that power. The water that surrounded their island was not just water. The fire at the center of their homes was not just fire. The movement of the seasons was not just a fact of climate. These things were all part of a universe that was fundamentally communicative, that spoke in the language of phenomena to those who knew how to listen. The final years of the Glastonbury Lake Village are marked in the archaeology by evidence of difficulty and deterioration. The island platform was subsiding. The structural timbers of the houses were rotting. The palisade was failing, and the broader political and social landscape of the region was being transformed by the arrival and consolidation of Roman power in the southwest. How the Lake Village community responded to these pressures is not something the archaeology tells us directly. Did they leave in an organized way, taking their most valuable possessions with them and redistributing themselves among the communities of the surrounding dry land? Or did they leave more chaotically, driven out by rising water that made the island uninhabitable faster than they could manage? Were there elderly people who refused to leave, who had lived their whole lives on the island and could not imagine life anywhere else? Were there children who had never known any home other than this wooden platform on the water? The objects that were left behind when the village was abandoned include things of considerable value. Not everything of worth was carried away. Either the departure was hasty, or the objects were intentionally left, given to the island and the water as a final offering, a way of returning to the place what had been borrowed from it over the centuries of occupation. In a world where the lake was not just a resource but a presence, not just water but a power with claims of its own, such a deliberate leaving behind would have been an entirely appropriate form of farewell. The island sank. The structures collapsed and were buried in peat. The lake, or what remained of it as the levels continued to drain over subsequent centuries, crept over the ruins. And the village disappeared from human knowledge as completely as if it had never existed. Until the summer of 1892, when a young man walked across a soggy field and noticed something odd about the ground. The Glastonbury Lake Village is not the only place in Britain where human prehistory has been revealed by drainage or by the accidental exposure of waterlogged sediments. The landscape of these islands is full of hidden things, preserved against the odds in bogs and lakes and river silts, waiting for the right conditions of exposure and the right investigator with the right questions to bring them back into the light. Starcar in North Yorkshire is one of the most significant prehistoric sites in Europe, a Mesolithic hunting camp on the edge of a lake that existed in the Vale of Pickering at the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,000 years ago. The site was discovered in 1948 and first excavated in the 1950s, and among the remarkable objects it yielded were 21 headdresses made from red deer skulls with the antlers still attached. the earliest evidence of shamanic or ritual practice ever found in Britain, and perhaps among the oldest such evidence in the world. The preservation of the organic materials at Starkar was possible only because the site was waterlogged, the remains sealed in the organic silts of the ancient lakebed. Seahenge, the remarkable Bronze Age timber circle discovered on a beach at Home Next the Sea in Norfolk in 1998, existed in a space that had formerly been marsh and that was being exposed by coastal erosion. The circle of 55 oak posts surrounding an inverted oak tree stump, buried with its roots uppermost in a way that seems to invert the normal relationship between earth and sky, was precisely dated by dendrochronology to the spring of 2049 BCE. The people who built it and for whom it had meaning lived 3,500 years before the Romans came to Britain. Seahenge is now in the Lynn Museum in King's Lynn, where it can be seen by the public. The bog bodies of Britain and Ireland, those extraordinary preserved human remains recovered from the peat bogs of the northern and western parts of these islands, represent some of the most haunting survivals from the prehistoric past anywhere in the world. Lindo Man, discovered in a Cheshire peat bog in 1984, is the best preserved of the British examples. He was a man of around 25 years old, who died violently in the 1st century CE, his death bearing the marks of what scholars interpret as a triple killing: strangulation, a blow to the head, and having his throat cut. The precision of the violence and the deliberate deposition of his body in the bog strongly suggests ritual killing, a sacrifice of some kind rather than murder. He was discovered when a peat-cutting machine at Lindo Moss sliced through the compressed remains that had lain undiscovered in the bog for 2,000 years. He is now in the British Museum, where he lies in his case, looking more like a person than most museum objects. His face, still carrying recognizable human features, his beard still stubbled on his preserved skin. These discoveries share a common thread: the accident of preservation in waterlogged conditions and the accident of discovery during drainage or erosion or peat-cutting operations that brought the preserved remains back to the surface. They also share the revelation they provide of a world that was hidden not because it was secretive or obscure, but simply because the materials of which it was made were not the materials that survive in dry conditions. The wooden and textile and organic world of prehistoric Britain, the world in which most people spent most of their time, has been almost entirely lost, except in these waterlogged pockets where the conditions were exactly right. This means that our understanding of British prehistory is systematically distorted by the differential survival of materials. We know far more about the stone tools and pottery and metal objects of the prehistoric past than we do about the wooden and organic materials that were quantitatively far more important in daily life. We know far more about the practices associated with the dead, whose bodies were sometimes buried in conditions that allow recovery, than we do about the practices of the living, whose daily routines left perishable traces that have almost universally decayed. Wetland archaeology corrects this distortion, partially and imperfectly, but importantly. It gives us back some of what we have lost. The significance of the Glastonbury Lake village for our understanding of pre-Roman Britain goes beyond the specific details of what was found there. It has a broader significance as a demonstration of what British prehistory was capable of the sophistication and complexity and cultural richness of a society that left no written records and was therefore, for most of the history of European historical scholarship, almost entirely invisible. The lake village was built by people who understood their environment with extraordinary precision. They knew the ecology of the wetland, the properties of the plants and animals it contained, the patterns of water level change through the seasons and the years. They knew how to build in wood on waterlogged ground, how to manage a complex multi-component structure, how to maintain an artificial island over centuries of use and periodic flooding. They made objects of art that stand comparison with anything produced in the contemporary Mediterranean world. They participated in trade networks that connected them to communities hundreds of miles away. They spoke a language that was the ancestor of languages still spoken today. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, civilized, though not civilized in the Roman sense that word usually implies. Rome came to Britain and changed everything. The roads, the towns, the Latin language, the administrative structures, the Christian religion that would eventually overlay the Roman period. All of these things transformed Britain fundamentally and are still shaping British life and culture today. The impact of Rome on the British Isles is not something that can be minimized or dismissed. It was profound and enduring. But before Rome, there was this: 300 years of a wooden island on a Somerset lake, a community that built something remarkable in a remarkable place, that lived there through wars and famines and floods and fires and all the ordinary disasters and joys of human existence, that made beautiful objects and spoke their beautiful language and looked out across the water of their lake at the changing sky, and that eventually left when the water finally won, taking what they could carry and leaving what they could not. They have been gone for 2,000 years, but the peat kept their story, and the story, once found, turns out to be one of the most extraordinary in the long human occupation of these islands. There is another dimension to the Glastonbury Lake Village story that deserves careful attention: the question of children. It is easy, when we reconstruct the past from the artifacts left behind by adults engaged in adult activities, to forget that any functioning community is also a community of children. Children who ran across the wooden planking of the island platform and fell into the water and were fished out spluttering by alarmed parents. Children who sat near the fire, watching their mothers weave, and began learning the patterns of warp and weft through imitation, long before they could articulate what they were doing. Children who listened to the adults telling stories in the winter evenings, absorbing the shape of the world as their culture understood it, learning the names of the powers that inhabited the wetland and the correct ways of addressing them. The presence of children in the archaeological record of the lake village is indirect but real. Miniature objects, small pots too tiny for practical use, and toys of various kinds, small clay figurines and carved wooden objects that seem to have no functional purpose, are scattered through the debris of the site. A child's footprint was identified in one area of clay floor, pressed into the wet clay and preserved when the clay hardened. Small personal ornaments, brooches and beads of a size appropriate for a child or a young adolescent appear in the collections. These small survivals are among the most affecting things in the archaeological record of the site. The ghost of a childhood lived 2,000 years ago, identifiable only in these incidental traces. The education of children in a pre-literate society was necessarily a different kind of education from anything we would recognize today. There were no schools, no books, no systematic instruction in a formal curriculum. Learning happened through doing, through watching and imitating, through the gradual accumulation of knowledge and skill that came from participating from the earliest age in the life of the community. A boy growing up in the lake village would have learned to fish before he could make a full-sized tool. He would have known the names of the birds that nested in the reeds before he could work a loom. He would have learned to read the water, to understand from the color and the smell and the movement of the lake what the weather was likely to do in the next few hours, what species of fish were likely to be active in what part of the lake, at what time of year. A girl growing up in the lake village would have learned the properties of the plants of the wetland margin, which were good for eating and which were poisonous, which had medicinal uses and in what preparations, which made good dyes and which produced fibers that could be spun. She would have learned the complex craft of weaving from a woman who had learned it from another woman in an unbroken chain of transmission. stretching back to the remote past. She would have learned the songs that were sung at the appropriate moments of the agricultural and pastoral year, the words spoken over a new fire, the form of the offering given at the edge of the water. Knowledge in an oral, pre-literate culture is not stored in books. It is stored in people. It is the accumulated experience and wisdom of the community, carried in the minds of its members and transmitted through the mechanisms of education and practice and example. When a skilled craftsperson died in the lake village, they took with them a body of knowledge that had taken a lifetime to acquire, and the community was diminished by exactly that much. This is why apprenticeship, the close relationship between an experienced practitioner and a learner who will eventually inherit that practice, is so fundamental to pre-literate communities. The transmission of knowledge through apprenticeship is the library of a society without writing. The extraordinary quality of the craft objects from the lake village reflects this system of knowledge transmission. The Glastonbury bowl was not made by an amateur. It was made by someone who had learned at the hands of another master, who had spent years developing the tactile understanding of wood and the manual precision needed to turn a vessel to that thinness on a pole lathe, who had absorbed the artistic tradition of lateen decoration from a master of that tradition and then made it their own. That level of skill takes years to develop and requires a specific form of transmission. The bowl is not just an object, it is a record of a relationship between a master and a learner, and behind that relationship lies a chain of similar relationships stretching back through time. There is one further aspect of the Lake Village story that modern research has illuminated in ways that Bullied and Gray could not have anticipated. The role of the settlement in the wider economy of the Somerset region, and specifically its potential involvement in the salt trade. Salt is one of the most fundamental commodities of any pre-modern economy. It is essential for preserving food, for processing hides, and in sufficient quantities for human health. In a world without refrigeration, the ability to preserve meat and fish through salting was the difference between having food in winter and going hungry, between a community that could survive the lean months and one that could not. Salt was therefore not just a commodity, it was strategic, it was power. The communities that controlled access to salt, or that sat astride the routes by which salt moved through a landscape, were communities that held a form of leverage over everyone around them. The Somerset coast, not far from the Lake Village site, had been a site of salt production since at least the Bronze Age. The tidal flats of the Severn estuary, where seawater could be concentrated and evaporated to produce salt crystals, were a natural resource that prehistoric communities exploited intensively. The evidence for this exploitation comes in the form of the briquetage already mentioned, the coarse ceramic vessels and supports used in the evaporation process, which are found at production sites along the Somerset and Avon coast and which appear in small quantities at inland sites where salt was being consumed and distributed. Whether the lake village was directly involved in the salt trade, whether it served as a distribution point or a storage centre or a processing station for salt moved inland from the coast, is not something the current archaeological evidence allows us to say with certainty. But its position in the wetland landscape, at a point where water routes from the coastal levels met the trackways of the drier inland ground, would have made it a natural node in any distribution network. The island site, with its controlled access and its clearly organized internal space, would have been well suited to the storage and distribution of a valuable commodity requiring secure handling. The broader point is that the Glastonbury Lake Village was not an economically self-sufficient community living in isolation from the wider world. Like all human communities, it was embedded in networks of exchange and dependence that extended far beyond its own boundaries. It depended on the dry land communities of the surrounding hills for grain and perhaps for timber. It traded the products of its craft workshops to communities across the region. It participated in the long-distance trade networks that moved shale and salt and metal, and perhaps slaves, across the Iron Age British landscape. It was, in the economic language of our own time, deeply integrated into its regional economy, and any disruption to that economy would have been felt within its wooden walls. This integration is itself evidence of sophistication. A community that produces specialist craft goods for export, that imports raw materials from distant sources, that manages complex exchange relationships with a range of partners, is a community with a level of economic organization and social capital that is very far from the primitive self-sufficiency that the popular imagination associates with prehistoric peoples. The lake villagers were not subsistence farmers who occasionally made a pot. They were specialists and traders who grew enough food to feed themselves and their dependents, and devoted significant time and energy to the production of goods that circulated in a market that extended across southern Britain and perhaps beyond. The metalwork from the site includes objects that were clearly made elsewhere and traded into the village. There are also objects that appear to have been made at the village or in its immediate vicinity, that parallel objects found at distant sites, suggesting that the products of the village workshops circulated widely. The relationship between production and distribution in the Iron Age economy of the Somerset region is still being worked out by archaeologists. But the broad outlines are clear. The lake village was not a consumer of other people's crafts. It was a producer. Its workshops made things that other people wanted, and those things moved through the networks of exchange that connected Iron Age Britain into a single, if loosely organized, economic world. The question of gender and the organization of labor at the Glastonbury Lake Village is one that modern archaeology approaches with considerably more sophistication than was possible in Bullied's time. Victorian and Edwardian archaeology operated with assumptions about gender roles that were drawn from the investigator's own cultural context and that were applied without critical examination to the prehistoric past. Women wove, men smithed. Women kept the house, men hunted and fought. These assumptions shaped not just the interpretation of artifacts, but the very categories through which the data was understood. Modern archaeology is more cautious and more questioning about these attributions. The evidence for gender-specific activities at the lake village is indirect and often ambiguous. The loom weights and spindle whorls that cluster in certain areas of the site might indicate female-dominated spaces if we assume that textile production was primarily a female activity, as it was in many historical cultures. But we cannot be certain that this assumption is correct for Iron Age Somerset. There are historical and ethnographic examples of cultures in which textile production was male-dominated or gender-neutral, and without skeletal evidence from the lake village allowing us to associate specific individuals with specific activity areas, the spatial patterning of artifacts can only take us so far. Similarly, the assumption that smithing was a male activity, while plausible by analogy with many historical metalworking traditions, cannot be taken as proven. The smithing areas of the lake village are characterized by iron slag and the heavy stone anvils and hammers used in ironworking, but there are no associated skeletal remains that would allow us to sex the people who worked there. What we can say with confidence is that the production activities at the lake village were intensive and skilled, that they required both physical strength and fine motor control in different combinations, and that they generated a material output of high quality that circulated beyond the immediate community. How the labor that produced this output was organized, who did what and in what social context, must remain largely unknown. But the question is worth asking, because the assumption of gender-specific labor divisions in the prehistoric past is one of those assumptions that shapes our narratives in ways we should be aware of and critical of. The evidence of isotope analysis, which is beginning to accumulate for the Somerset Iron Age as a whole, rather than for the lake village specifically, suggests that individuals moved between communities during their lifetimes, probably through practices of marriage alliance that saw young people leaving their birth community and joining another. If this is correct, then the lake village community at any given time would have included people who had grown up in different places, who brought with them knowledge and practices from their communities of origin, and who had integrated these diverse backgrounds into the working community of the island settlement. This kind of constant influx of new people and new knowledge would have been a source of both cultural richness and social complexity, and managing the integration of newcomers while maintaining the coherence of community identity would itself have required sophisticated social skills. The story of how the Glastonbury Lake Village came to be known to the wider British public is itself a story worth telling, because it illustrates something important about how archaeology functions as a cultural practice, how the past is presented to the present, and what we choose to do with the knowledge that archaeology recovers. Bullied was a careful and methodical scientist, but he was also a man with a gift for communication. He lectured widely about his discoveries, to learned societies and to public audiences, and he was skilled at conveying the excitement and significance of what he had found in terms that non-specialist audiences could engage with. The Glastonbury Lake Village became known across Britain in the decades after its discovery, and it captured the public imagination in a way that few archaeological sites of its period managed to do. Part of the reason was timing. The discovery of the Lake Village came at a moment when questions of British national identity were particularly live. The late Victorian and Edwardian period was a time of imperial confidence in Britain, but also of anxiety about the country's place in a world that was changing rapidly. The discovery of a remarkable prehistoric settlement, demonstrating that the British Isles had been home to sophisticated, creative, technologically accomplished people thousands of years before the Romans came, spoke to something in the national psyche. It suggested a depth of British civilization that was not dependent on the Roman inheritance, a native tradition of achievement that predated the classical world. This was a somewhat problematic framing, as later scholars recognized. The lake villagers were not English in any meaningful sense. They were not proto-British in the way that Victorian nationalists sometimes wanted them to be. They were part of a wider Celtic and European world, connected to the continent in ways that complicated any narrative of island separateness. But the emotional appeal of their discovery, the sense of depth and richness that it added to the British past, was real, and it drove genuine public interest in the site and in prehistoric archaeology more broadly. The Glastonbury Lake Village Museum, opened in the town of Glastonbury itself, became a significant draw for visitors to the area, adding a layer of genuine prehistoric history to the mythological associations of Glastonbury that had been drawing spiritual tourists for generations. Glastonbury's connections to Arthurian legend, to early Christianity, to a range of New Age spiritual traditions had made it a destination for people seeking something beyond the ordinary. The lake village added to this something rigorously real, not myth or legend, but actual physical evidence of actual people who had lived extraordinary lives in the extraordinary landscape of the levels. The relationship between the lake village and the broader tradition of wetland sacred deposition in Somerset is illuminated particularly clearly by the discoveries made over the years at Cheddar Gorge and its surrounding landscape. The Mendip Hills, which overlook the Somerset levels from the north, are riddled with caves formed in the Carboniferous limestone, and those caves have preserved evidence of human activity stretching back far beyond the Iron Age, far beyond even the Neolithic and Bronze Age, into the deep time of the Ice Age itself. Cheddarman, whose remains were discovered in Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge in 1903, and who was dated subsequently to around 9,000 years ago, is the oldest near-complete human skeleton ever found in Britain. He was a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer, short by modern standards. Dark-skinned, as recent DNA analysis has revealed, with blue eyes living in the post-glacial landscape of the Mendip Edge, at a time when the Somerset levels below were still a mixture of forest and wetland, still slowly emerging from the submergence of the last ice age. The DNA analysis of Cheddarman, published in 2018, found that he shared genetic profiles with many present-day people in Somerset, and with a schoolteacher from Cheddar itself, demonstrating an extraordinary continuity of population across 9,000 years of British history. The people, whose descendants still live in Somerset today, have been in Somerset since before the Neolithic Revolution, before farming came to Britain from the continent, before the building of Stonehenge, before the construction of any of the Bronze Age and Iron Age monuments that we tend to think of as the beginning of the British story. This genetic continuity puts the Lake Village in a different perspective. The people who built the Glastonbury Lake Village were not newcomers to the Somerset landscape. They were the inheritors of a relationship with that landscape that stretched back through the Neolithic and Bronze Age to the Mesolithic hunters who sheltered in the Cheddar Caves 9,000 years before. The knowledge of the wetland that they expressed so brilliantly in their island settlement was not knowledge that appeared from nowhere in the Iron Age. It was the product of millennia of accumulated human engagement with this particular landscape, built up through generations of observation and practice and transmission. This depth of connection to place is one of the things that the Glastonbury Lake Village illustrates most powerfully. It was not a random choice of site. It was not an improvised response to immediate circumstances. It was the expression of a profound and ancient understanding of a landscape that human communities had been living with and in for thousands of years. The lake was not new to them. The water was not strange to them. The materials of the wetland, the reeds and the willows and the alder and the clay, were not unfamiliar resources. They were the materials with which generations of their ancestors had built their lives, and the Lake Village was in some sense the culmination of all that accumulated knowledge, the most ambitious and sophisticated expression of a tradition of wetland living that reached back to the very beginning of the post-glacial period in Britain. The archaeologists who have worked on the Glastonbury Lake Village in the decades since Bullied's time have been struck again and again by a paradox that sits at the heart of the site. The village is extraordinary. Its preservation, its artistic output, its engineering achievement, its demonstration of a sophisticated and organized community life. All of these things mark it as exceptional. And yet, in another sense, it was probably not exceptional at all within its own time and place. It was not the only lake village in Britain. It was not even the only lake village in the Somerset levels. The Meare villages nearby demonstrate that the practice of building artificial island settlements in the wetland was a recognized and presumably relatively widespread tradition in the region. And beyond Britain, across the Celtic world of Iron Age Europe, similar settlements existed in many areas where water and wetland provided both the resources and the motivation for this extraordinary form of habitation. The Swiss lake dwellings that inspired Bullied's search are the most numerous and best studied examples outside Britain. The alpine lakes of Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and northern Italy preserve the remains of hundreds of prehistoric lake-edge settlements, ranging from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age, built on platforms of timber, driven into the shallower margins of the lakes, and representing communities that exploited the water for food and transport while maintaining access to the agricultural land of the surrounding shores. The Swiss lake-dwelling tradition was not identical to the Somerset lake villages. The Swiss sites were generally built on the lake shore, rather than in open water, and they represent a different architectural tradition. But they share the fundamental understanding of the water as a resource and a boundary, and they share the extraordinary preservation conditions that make the reconstruction of daily life possible in ways that dryland archaeology simply cannot achieve. In Ireland, the tradition of the Crannog, the artificial island settlement, extends from the Bronze Age through the early medieval period, and crannogs are found in lakes across the Irish landscape, from the great loughs of the Midlands to the mountain lakes of the West. Many Irish crannogs were occupied into the historic period, and the early medieval law texts of Ireland contain regulations concerning crannogs that give us a glimpse of how these settlements were understood within the social and legal framework of early medieval Irish society. Crannogs were places of status. They were associated with kings and nobles. Living on a crannog was a marker of power and wealth, because only those with sufficient resources and organizational capacity could build and maintain such a structure. Whether the same social associations attached to the lake village at Glastonbury is not something we can determine from the archaeological evidence alone, but the sheer investment of labour and material that went into building the Glastonbury island and the quality of the craft objects produced and consumed there both suggest a community with access to significant resources, a community that was not at the bottom of the social hierarchy of its region. The crannogs of Scotland, particularly those of the southwestern Highlands and Islands, add yet another dimension to the tradition. The Loch Tay crannogs in Perthshire, several of which have been surveyed and partially excavated in recent decades, include examples that date to the Iron Age, contemporary with the Glastonbury Lake village, and that have yielded remarkable preserved organic materials, including wooden objects, textiles, and food remains. The Scottish Crannog Centre on the shores of Loch Tay has reconstructed one of these settlements as a full-scale working replica, built using the tools and techniques of the Iron Age as far as they can be determined from the archaeological evidence. Visiting the reconstructed crannog, you can stand on the wooden platform and feel the lake water moving slightly beneath your feet. Feel the particular quality of light that comes off open water. Hear the sound of wind moving across the surface. It is as close as you can get, standing in the 21st century, to understanding what it might have felt like to live in a lake village 2,000 years ago. The reconstructed crannog at Loch Tay demonstrates something else as well, how quickly the sense of the water changes when you are on it rather than beside it. Standing on a lakeshore, you are on land that happens to be next to water. Standing on a platform in the lake, you are in the water. The orientation of your experience shifts completely. The lake is not the backdrop. It is the context. It is the world that surrounds you on all sides, that provides the sounds and the smells and the constant small movements that structure every moment of existence. Living on the water changes your relationship to the world in ways that are probably impossible to fully recover imaginatively from the dry land of the 21st century, but that the reconstructed crannog gives at least a partial sense of. The people of the Glastonbury Lake village lived in the water, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically and practically. They woke up on the water. They worked on the water. They fell asleep on the water, hearing the small sounds of the lake at night, the calls of waterfowl, the occasional splash of a feeding fish, the movement of water against the palisade stakes. The water was their foundation and their boundary and their resource and their protection. It shaped everything about how they understood the world and everything about how they moved through it. This is the final thing to understand about the Glastonbury Lake village, and perhaps the most important. It is not just an archaeological site. It is a demonstration of a way of being in a landscape that is profoundly different from anything most people in the modern world have experienced. A way of being that was intimate with water, dependent on water, attuned to water in every detail of daily life. A way of being that saw in the wetland not wilderness to be conquered and drained, but a home, a place of abundance and meaning, a landscape so rich with possibility that it was worth the enormous effort of building a home in the middle of it. The people who built the Glastonbury Lake village knew something about living in the world that we have largely forgotten. They knew how to read the water. They knew what the lake was saying when its surface changed color and texture. They knew which plants grew where and why and what they were good for. They knew how to build with the materials the wetland provided, how to make a home that worked with the landscape rather than against it. This knowledge was not primitive. It was sophisticated in ways that are different from but not inferior to the sophistication of the technological civilization that eventually replaced the lake village world. The lake is gone now, drained into rinds and pumped away by the great pumping stations of the Somerset levels. The village is underground. The people are 2,000 years dead. But the field is still there. And if you stand in that field on a still evening in late autumn, when the mist is coming in off the levels and the light is going golden in the west, and the herons are making their slow way home to their roosts in the alder trees, you can feel something of what this place was. You can feel the presence of the water that used to be here, the memory of it in the soft ground under your feet. You can feel the weight of time, the depth of the human story that has played out in this landscape over 10,000 years and more. And somewhere beneath your feet, sealed in the dark and the cold and the peat, the village waits. The planks of its platform, the clay of its hearths, the scattered fragments of its beautiful objects, all of it still there, still patient, still holding the story of the people who built it and lived in it and left it and never came back. Older than Rome, preserved by the water that eventually defeated it, discovered by a young man with a probe and a conviction that there was something here worth finding. There was. There is. There always will be. If you have watched this far, please leave a comment below and tell us what surprised you most about the Glastonbury Lake Village. We read every comment and your responses genuinely shape the videos we make next. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with someone who loves British history. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have not already done so. There is much more of this kind of history to come. The hidden stories of these islands, the things that sit just beneath the surface of the landscape waiting to be found. We will be here, still looking. We hope you will be too. Have sometimes spoken about the experience of excavating there in terms that go beyond the purely professional. There is something about working on a site of this kind, recovering objects that were last touched by human hands 2,000 years ago, that affects people in ways that are hard to describe in the language of academic publications. The moment of discovery, when a worked wooden object emerges from the black peat, still wet, still flexible, still bearing the tool marks of the craftsman who shaped it, is by all accounts an extraordinary experience. The object has not seen light since the Iron Age. It has not been touched since the hand that last set it down before the village was abandoned. And now here it is, in your hands, in the grey light of a Somerset morning, as real and immediate as the trowel you are holding. Arthur Bullied wrote about this experience in his memoirs. The objects that came out of the Glastonbury peat, he wrote, had a quality of immediacy that he found in no other archaeological site he worked on. They were not merely ancient, they were present. They demanded engagement not just as data points in an archaeological argument, but as things that people had made and used and valued, things that carried within them the memory of the hands and minds that created them. This is the gift that wetland archaeology gives, and it is a gift that the Glastonbury Lake Village has been giving since Bullied first pushed his probe into that Somerset field in 1892. It gives back not just information, but presence. Not just the facts of the past, but the feel of it. Not just the what, but the something approaching the how it felt to be there. In that place, at that time, surrounded by water and sky and the small daily miracles of a life lived with skill and attention in one of the most remarkable landscapes in Britain. The field is still there. The field is still flat and green and crossed by its dark rinds. The herons still stand at the water's edge, and beneath the surface, beneath the pale clay and the dark peat, the village is still there too. Not gone, not lost. Just waiting, as it has waited for 2,000 years, for the next person to come along and notice that something is a little different about the ground, something older than Rome, something that was here before the roads and the walls and the names that we now use for everything, something that was built with extraordinary ingenuity and care, on the water, in the middle of the levels, by people who understood this landscape so deeply that they chose to live at its very heart. The village beneath the lake, the village that time forgot and the peat preserved. The village that, once found, reminded everyone who studied it that the story of Britain is longer and stranger and richer than anyone had imagined. It is still there. And it is still telling its story to anyone willing to wade through a wet Somerset field and listen.